Dai, I'm interested in your role, your title. It's not security manager, it's resilience manager. What's the difference?
Broadly, within Sydney Water there's a separation between operational security and strategic security. And the strategic context which I own is more based around the resilience of critical infrastructure, both in an organisational context, i.e. what's critical to us to deliver service, but also what's critical from the government's perspective, particularly in relation nowadays to terrorist targeting. Moreover, it's the fact, and to leverage off what one of the other guys said earlier, is the fact that it's resilient specifically simply because it recognises that security is a component of the organisation's ability to prepare and respond and recover.
So what's so important about resilience? What does resilience bring to the party?
If nothing else, I think a lot of the contemporary thinking sort of says that it's an end state, or a goal, sorry, not an end state in its own right. It's a way of thinking, it's a way of operating, and certainly there's lots of examples around the world which give us a strong indication that you can't plan for everything. Moreover, you can't actually identify all of the possible permutations of threat or risk. So consequently what that does is gives you, or should give you, a very, not hands-off approach, but certainly a much more pragmatic view around, yes, you need to identify the threats, but it's the focus of the organisation specifically, and certainly one for us like with water, it's actually the impacts that we're interested in, simply because that's where we begin to see the convergence between the different threat and risk types.
How important is it then to think about, if you're an airport, it doesn't really matter what shuts it down. It could be a terrorist attack, a fire or a flood. The airport's shut down. The important thing is how quickly can you get back to business? Is that what we're talking about here?
Exactly that, yeah. Certainly from our perspective, and to touch on the points that Michael made in terms of, you've got these three sort of groups where you've got government, the community, and the owners or operators of critical infrastructure. Certainly the majority of the impact that we feel, particularly from a reputational perspective, actually has nothing to do with the risk itself. It's more about the perception or the expectation that was set beforehand around service or supply continuity. And certainly a lot of possibly the older sort of protection, robustness mindset was very much around, removing the possibility of the threat manifesting or occurring, whereas actually where we are now is very much a case of, it actually doesn't matter what the threat is, the impacts broadly will be the same. And so consequently our primary stakeholder, which is the customer, they just want to know that when they turn the tap on or flush the toilet that the service is there. And so that's very much where our focus goes, rather than on necessarily trying to articulate or identify and plan for a specific threat, simply because that's not in our supply chain.
Now, we've heard it a bit from the federal government view of the TISN, but you're at the other end of the scale, you're at the state level, working within the TISN. What's the view from your end?
There's a very clear delineation between that sort of operational and non-operational focus, and certainly given that, even within that, we're only a part of the New South Wales sort of footprint, given that we only operate in Greater Sydney, Blue Mountains and the Illawarra. Ours is very much, in the same way that our plans are impact-based and our thinking is very much around the continuity of supply, it's then very much a sort of train like you fight mindset, wherein it's the application of the response and the recovery that will largely define successful failure in the customer's eyes. Whilst the cross-sectoral stuff is very important because it will bring out a lot of the similarities or a lot of the common interdependence between threat-based thinking or plans, certainly I think there's an opportunity to do a bit more at the state level to drive that. And it's all the stuff about networking and mutual aid and commonality in sort of plans and response. I think things like Christchurch have really brought that into stark context, simply because the expectation of the public rested very heavily with government and not so much the actual owners or operators, but equally the thing that was lacking in that sense was a correct or common context, simply because when you look at an unforeseen event of that scale, all bets were off. It didn't matter that people wanted there to be water and wastewater services, it was physically impossible, and so the conversation changed very, very quickly. And I think the challenge now, particularly at the estate level, is to begin to try and front load as much of that thinking as possible, given the fact obviously there's a political driver which would not necessarily want those conversations to be had in as fearless and frank a manner as perhaps is necessary to give us that catalyst for change.
You mentioned political drivers there. There's also commercial drivers in a lot of industries. But we just heard that within the water sector, you're actually very good at sharing information and very good at collaborating. Why is the water sector so good at collaborating?
Despite the geographic differences, I think it's in the same way as oil and gas. You're doing pretty much the same thing with the same stuff, just in different places, different sizes, and depending upon the way in which that organisation is constituted for a different boss or series of masters. So I think there's a great deal of commonality where that information exchange, that cooperation can occur. I think in that context that mutual aid becomes a very real proposition, simply because certainly in the water sector there aren't those commercial sensitivities whereby competition would preclude any form of sort of prevention or preparedness activity. That said, that landscape may change. I think the beauty of the fact that there are so many water entities spread all over Australia means that it's incredibly unlikely that they will all be affected in the same way at the same time, which means inherently as a sector group there's some capacity or redundancy for assistance. I think what TISN has recognised in terms of the cross-sectoral stuff is, whether due to a very large-scale event like a Christchurch or a Fukushima, or whether it's because of a particular comms, technology, cyber incident, that could change the picture very, very quickly if there was a widespread outage upon an interdependent or critical system. And so I think that's where the direction is going, and the conversations are beginning to change somewhat, simply because what that forces is there's a whole bunch of stuff that matters, and there's a whole bunch of stuff that you can control, but the overlap between the two is actually quite small. And what that will force in a large-scale or unforeseen event is organisations, and Sydney Water would be the same, would have to prioritise its own interests over those mutual aid arrangements, simply because the expectation of the regulator or stakeholder in a response is not absolute, but it's not far off. Look, I think the conversations that I have, whether they be in the water sector or elsewhere, I think particularly in relation to recent events, is what I do see is there's a stark difference between emotion and logic, and I think one of the challenges for people like myself is we deal in the kind of, we operate in a BAU context, and therefore it's logical, so things should, are risk-based, and hopefully, metrics are performance-based, and improvement plans and audits begin to, find those vulnerabilities and gaps and address them. But what you're then faced with is obviously when something occurs, is there's the questions or the drivers are emotional, not logical. And I think the comms piece is then very, very important, because, and I go back to my own context with Martin Place and more recently the shooting in Parramatta. None of the questions were logical. And so answering an emotional need with a logical, sort of statement or fact or report actually does a lot to disconnect you from the organisation in their mind, because at the point that somebody has an emotional driver, that need needs to be met before there's context. And I think, whilst we're good at providing, the risk in context in a BAU setting, I think there's a real opportunity to develop that thinking further around the capacity to manage disruption and stress, rather than just focusing on the capability of the organisation to develop plans.
That distinction between security and resilience, I think, is an interesting one that could probably be teased out. I was also interested in what you were saying about communications. And I do wonder, are security and resilience people good at communicating? It always seems to me there's a brilliant opportunity for them to demonstrate leadership on a day-to-day basis, not just in an emergency. And I just wonder, do you think resilience managers, security managers, what you call them, do you think they take that opportunity often enough, or do you think they have the skill sets or the ability to take those opportunities?
I think what we're very good at is articulating why we're different, and we group together because we have a shared sort of background or subject matter expertise. I think the key for that credibility to achieve the context in those conversations is actually articulating why we're the same. So, for example, I've been asked on a couple of occasions by people entering the industry, which security risk management degree or course they should do, and actually I say to them, in almost all cases, don't do that, go and do an MBA, simply because, not because you're going to go and run a business, which they may, but the fact is what it will do is give them the ability to talk to the stakeholders in their context, rather than trying to teach them ours.